KSI. What an interesting character. Now, I was introduced to this fellow from one of my disability clients. I've never heard of him. I'd never heard of the Sidemen, and I had no idea the size of the following. So for me, like I'm 43 this year, and that whole influencer world, the YouTuber world, I'm oblivious to. And I was introduced to it by a 19-year-old who lives his life on the internet. Right? He lives his life TikTok, YouTube, and back-to-backs, like KSI's content, Sidemen content, and all of the derivatives of this entire YouTuber world. And while I was doing research on KSI, who's like I mentioned, he's a fascinating guy, and he actually was born and grew up in Watford, which is where I was born, and I grew up in Watford. And he's only spent 4 years in England. But when I saw that he was from Watford, I was like, oh wow, like what a small world. And from there, I went to research his mum and his dad and his brother and his girlfriends. Now, he's also got an Amazon Prime documentary that came out in January 2023. And I deliberately chose to not look at that for two reasons. One, I didn't want to spend the time doing that. And I also wanted to see how accurately I could gauge him based on just characterology. And for those of you who are not familiar with characterology, it is a technology that was built by Wilhelm Reich, Alexander Lowen, and John Parakos, where Wilhelm Reich saw that in his clients, who is he's a psychotherapist and psychoanalyst, Wilhelm Reich saw that there was physical characteristics in the body that were similar to pathology, behavioral pathology that would show up. And he mapped this trend over time, and he could see that there were specific body shapes that would exhibit trauma patterning that was worth noting and exploring. And Alexander Lowen continued that work, and so did John Parakos. So what I do in my work is I can look at someone's body and with a great deal of accuracy predict what their childhood patterns are, childhood patterns of trauma are, how that plays out in relationships, and how that plays out in life. So in the context of KSI, or JJ, I don't know I cannot pronounce his Nigerian name, is his final form is a narcissistic rigid. And I've done other narcissistic rigids before, but KSI is an interesting derivative because he has more passive feminine in him than other narcissistic rigids that I've done before, or phallic narcissistic males, which is like the Conor McGregors. So the Conor McGregor, he's very phallic narcissistic. However, with KSI, he's got a bit more masochism in him. And by masochism, I mean a self-destructive arc. Someone who is passive, someone who still cares about what other people think and feel about him. That's the masochistic, the passive feminine side. So let's get a little bit deeper into KSI. Now, I know I said I didn't watch the documentary, and I was able to pull some quotes off the documentary from what I found on the internet. And this one-liner really stood out for me, which confirmed my analysis of what he is. And this is classic rigid, right? And I really want this line to land for you. KSI narrates, "I don't think anyone actually knows who I am, including me." And that is a classic rigid line where a rigid grows up to be something that they're not. They put on mask after mask to get parental approval, and then partner approval, and then societal approval. And in all of these masks, they forget who they really are. And like KSI's life is a show. It's a show. So he needs to put on a persona whenever he's in front of a camera, even when he's out in public. And he's deeply self-conscious about his forehead. So he's always wearing headscarves or something to cover up his genetically large forehead. And some of his mates on Sidemen mock him on occasion. And that's something that he's humiliated by, his past, his genetics, who he is as a person at the core. He needs to cover up. And this will be the recurring theme as we go through this. is that who he is at the core, he doesn't know who he is. And what happens when a rigid doesn't know who they are, the trend over time is their death wish. You can Google death wish. His death wish will eventually catch up with him. And this is where depression takes over and high-risk behavior to basically attempt to end himself because he cannot withstand the pressure of being something he's not. His true self will eventually come through, and it will need to be faced either through therapy or working with a specialist like myself to take him into the bowels, the darkness of who he really is at the core, and stop pretending that the identity that he's created is actually him. Now, when I say his life is a show, part of his documentary involved him hugging his father after 10 years of being estranged from him. And if you're 10 years estranged from someone, just magically fix that. Unless you're on a show. And that looks very good for ratings and heartfelt, pulling heartstrings. And he's had a habit of doing this. KSI likes to manipulate his followers for reactions and views and whatever else to get popularity, to feed his ego, to make him feel better about himself. And this is classic rigid behavior. And there's also an undertow of it's never enough. And this is where his orality comes in. And his orality is in his eyes. See, his eyes are a bit buggy. So orality has your eyes bugging out of your head, where you're looking for something. There's something that's just not big enough for you. There's nothing that's going to satiate this inner hunger. And this is that void. And the rigid can cover this up very well, especially in the YouTuber world. There's lots of YouTubers with an oral injury. They just love to be a center of attention. Here's another quote. This is his brother speaking. He might be blinded with success, that he knows the consequences, but he doesn't care, his brother says. His father later tells the camera that JJ is easygoing, KSI is just ... before his interjects with his ego. His father then concludes, I don't think I'd want to have KSI as a son. So KSI was ridiculed by his parents when he started his YouTube career, didn't like school, and succeeded in YouTube, music, and boxing, where he's one of the most highest paid YouTuber of all time, amassed a great deal of wealth, popularity, a following. And he keeps reiterating that his father's disciplinary actions affected him during his childhood. And there's a deep resentment there. And with the rigid, what shows up is when their parents challenge them in their teenage years of who they really are. Usually it's his mum. Usually it starts with the mum. And if you look at KSI's mum, she's a masochistic psychopath. If you have a look at pictures of her, you can see she's she's heavy. Like her energy is like all encompassing, like a devouring mother / terrible mother. And if you have a look at devouring mother and terrible mother, you'll know what I'm talking about. These are archetypes. And I was watching a video where KSI was irritating and agitating his mum by getting a tattoo on his arm, which is very childish. You just want to get a rise up out of your mum. This is a teenager injury. Still not repaired. And so what shows up here is if his mother was challenging him and KSI went to rebel, his dad protects the mum because the dad is more interested in the relationship with the mum instead of what is true. And if his dad lives in a state of fear, which he does because his dad is passive feminine, that state of fear will want KSI to conform to societal models because he hasn't forged his own path in the world. He's followed in somebody else's footsteps. He's done the whole get a job, do this, do that. So he's not actually forged his own path. He just plays it safe. And passive feminine men do play it safe. They're unwilling to cause conflict, right? Which is why when I look at a really good phallic narcissistic male, Conor McGregor, and check out my video on Conor McGregor, he doesn't give a he knows that he can generate wealth. He knows that he doesn't need YouTube telling him the terms and conditions of whatever he wants to say. He'll just say whatever he wants. But with KSI, he's bound by platforms that have a policy, right? And he got in trouble for some sexual harassment way back when. And the rigid has struggled expressing their sexual wants and needs. They tend to have sex with contempt. And because he's part masochistic, so he's got a bit of the passive feminine man in him as well, he'll be a bit of a people pleaser in the bedroom. And you might see this if you do. Sidemen have got a really cool game that they do, which is real life Tinder. And great, you got to go watch them. They're really interesting videos. And what I love watching is the relationship between the women and the men. You can see in the first few seconds of how intimidated that some of these guys feel to women who are just out for sex, right? They just want to use you. And what I see is KSI covers his balls up a lot. And body language wise, when you're covering up your groin, you're afraid of displaying your potency, your sexual potency. Like if you look at someone like Conor McGregor or Andrew Tate, their pelvis is forward, right? Their cock is out. I think they're there to it's a completely different energy. So if you look at some of these side men, you can see that they're repressed, they're sexually repressed. Like they've gone through life being influencers and having a great following, and there's a need to suppress their sexuality because in a politically correct world, in a world where you just want to speak your truth and speak whatever's there and just don't give a fuck, like being able to tone that down, you also mute your sexuality as well, which comes across to KSI's racial slur where he used Paki in conversation, right? And like for me, there's no charge on Paki. Like I used to get called a Paki, right? It's a slur for Pakistani. It's like, and I've got Pakistani blood in me, but it's not something I've done enough shadow work and inner work for not to have any charge on me. You could call me anything. You could call me any kind of slur and I'll just ground it. Like I get it. I understand. But then in the world that's politically correct, in a world that wants to try and create even more victims, you need to curtail. You need to edit yourself. So in that needing to edit yourself is a part of you that is denied, and that part of you that is denied will come up in some other way. For example, if KSI was really angry one day and he's confronted with someone who looks kind of Pakistani, he might say something might come out of his mouth that will be from that lower self because he's not present around, he's not present to it. Because for a rigid to confront their lower self on those parts of them that despises humanity, that is disgusted by humanity, they've got to be witnessed and loved through it to be able to feel that humiliation, know that they're a part of them, that person that they're denigrating, they're actually a part of who they are at the core. And then KSI's relationships, this is an interesting one. So KSI, he's kept his relationship life quite secret. And unless you follow him on YouTube or maybe have the inside line about his partnerships, not much is really known about his girlfriends. So in that, he's created this life of needing to be public, needing to be known, creating fame through content creation. And then his private life, he's trying to keep private. But then people are prying. People are interested in him because he's made an image of himself that is interesting, right? So with his women, and what will show up here is he's not going to be able to maintain a long-term relationship because he still has a rigid injury, which is kind of heartbreaking. And he was with a girl called Shauna for a while, who was another influencer. And they had a long-distance relationship. And for those of you that don't know or haven't looked at my Facebook content or my written content, long-distance relationships are really helpful for someone who is avoidant. Having relationships where you communicate by text or by video, it makes it very easy to bypass the attachment injuries that you have. And if you don't know what attachment is, there's plenty of videos on YouTube if you want to have a look at it. I don't particularly like attachment because I think it bypasses the core injuries, like the instinctual injuries that are going on in your body. And you can get lost in a bit of a rabbit hole of attachment. So in the context of KSI and Shauna, when they started to get a little bit closer, then their relationship would most likely fall apart. Why? Because when they're in physical proximity with each other, that's when all the attachment injuries come up. When you're in a long-distance relationship, you don't really need to speak to your wants and your needs. They're implied by the distance. For example, you don't need to ask for space because at some point, both of you are going to go to bed. There's no need to cook each other meals. There's no need to have those deep and meaningful conversations around exes or what pisses you off about the other person. right? So if you think that you're in a long distance relationship now and it's working, well, I'd double check. Or if you haven't met this person, I'd double check. Or if there's no long-term vision of a plan of being together and staying with each other, then I'd question. Because particularly rigids, love using long-distance relationships as an illusion to actually having a relationship. Now, KSI shared a post a while ago about that he was single and alone. And like a relationship with him, it's usually get a 3-year itch. Avoidance tend to get a 3-year itch. They can try to kind of make it work for about 3 years, and then it's like you can't. It's too much. And there's also a 3, 6, and 9 month cycle in relationships. And if you don't know that, then jump over to my Facebook group, and I can get you hooked up with one of those. What happens here is a rigid who has not done any inner work on his core attachment injuries. And if you look at his mum, man, there's going to be some injuries there between him and his dad. Him and his dad and his mum, that triangle, he'll have some attachment injuries there, and he's going to struggle in relationships for the rest of his life unless he gets help. Which some people might love for him to never have a relationship because he's entertaining, right? His life is entertaining to me. Me living vicariously through KSI means I never have to look at my own life. Watching an influencer, the side beam, whatever it is, as an augmented reality for you to exist or spend your time and energy, or even if you're having it playing in the background, it's just white noise. It's not taking you anywhere. I've watched some of these things, like them in amusement parks or playing that online game, or even the Tinder thing, real life Tinder. Like, it's all vapid emptiness to entertain you. It's all bread and circus. And while you might think it's fun for you, what are you doing with your life? Like, do you want to be like them? Like, have a video crew following you around, making you lots of money? They'll reach a critical mass of all of this. There'll be so much content out there, you won't know what to watch. Everyone will have their own stream. Everyone will want to be like KSI. Release your own drink. Make your own, do boxing, do rap, whatever it is. But how are you actually being of service? How are you helping mankind? And while he's given some donations away, like, if you actually look at his viewing hours, like millions and millions and millions of hours of views. Now, what is he actually adding? It's all entertainment. And whoever's watching it is choosing to spend their attention in that way. How do you want to spend your life? If life is the most priceless currency that is available right now, that is how you are spending your life. And if you've listened this far, thank you. I appreciate it. Now, if I was to treat KSI, this is what I would help him confront. His feelings. What's actually alive for him in his life? Who he has become. And is he willing to give up? Is he willing to give up who he's become? Because right now, I don't see him being able to have a healthy relationship with himself or other people. Every single time a rigid puts on a mask, a little piece of them dies. And the longer you do it, like I mentioned at the start, the longer you do it, the harder it is to find you at the end. So if he's someone who's relying on political correctness and avoiding cancel culture, then there's no way he'll be able to maintain this facade for his whole life. He'll just become more rigid. It'll just show up in his body. Neck, back, legs, hips, breath. He just won't be able to keep up. If I was to treat him, like I mentioned before, it would be body work around his chest and his back, and body work around his hips and his feet. We'll be taking him deeper into the psychodynamics of his relationship with his mum and his dad, actually accessing the rage that he has towards his dad and the humiliation that he felt from his dad's physical actions towards him, the humiliation that he felt from his mother, about his mother not being able to love him for who he was, the initial disappointment and the despair of not being supported by his parents when he couldn't do school. He couldn't do school. So where was the support then? And also some angst towards his brother. Then there'll also be some sexual things with his mate Simon. So there's the phallic narcissistic male and the passive feminine man can have issues around homosexuality where they will not confront it. They will not confront their feelings of sexuality. So there's a lot of homosexual innuendo that goes on in their conversation. And it's a disowned innuendo. It's not owned. It's not fun. It's not playful. It's kind of half in, half out. If you like that pun, half in, half out. So what else I have here for KSI would be to give him permission to be fully expressed, which might mean getting his own platform so he can actually speak to the stuff that he actually feels passionate about, like properly passionate. Because until he's able to speak his truth and act authentically, he'll just forever be a puppet on a string for his audience. Puppet on a string. And that's a rigid. From teenage years to adulthood, they're just puppets on a string, either performing for their parents or performing for peers or performing for family, performing for partners, because they don't know who they are at the core. Because when someone's public life and private life is two separate things, that causes a schism and a fragment of who you are, which eventually leads to, well, you've seen what happens to people who do that. The famous, who have a fragmented public life and private life. They don't know how to deal with fame. And I don't think anyone's really mastered how to deal with fame. I think Dolly Parton came pretty close. But even with Dolly Parton, there's something that's missing. There's something that's there that's off for her. And it'll show up in her body. So where we end is where we begin. The Ouroboros. I don't think anyone actually knows who I am, including me. And if you're someone who that statement speaks to you, I don't think anyone actually knows who I am, including me, then this is a rigid injury. And in order to get to this place requires you to be brutally honest with yourself. And if you don't want to do that, that's fine. And it will show up in your body and your relationships. You will be living a lie. And that's okay. And I don't want you to live a lie. I want you to be free. I want you to find people in your life that love you for who you are. So stop pretending. Do the work that's required to confront this mask. Do the work that's required to confront the lower self, the parts of you that you're denying. This cookie cutter vanilla flavoring that you're throwing over the top of your life is just going to be a lie. And there's a rage and a wrath and grief there of living a life that is a lie. So when you're willing to know who you are, know thyself, instead of being entertained by people who are just a show, fake, don't really know who they are, unable to be authentically expressed, forever performing like a lot of influencers on YouTube are, with this oral injury and rigid injury, then that's your life. Just remember that life is, I think, the most valuable resource. So if you're someone who's spending your life and vitality binging YouTube videos of guys running around in costumes, while it looks like a lot of fun, it's mind-numbingly inane. What are they contributing other than to the vapid void of nothing, when in a decade's time, they'll just be digits on someone's hard drive, digits on YouTube's hard drive. What's their legacy? What's your legacy? And to find your legacy, you need to confront who you are. And confronting who you are means confronting your past. And confronting your past means being very honest, being brutally honest with how you were raised and how your identity fragmented to stay alive. All right. If you listen to this, thank you so much for staying to the end. I deeply appreciate your time and energy and consideration. I've got multiples of these characterology videos. And if you'd like to see anyone in particular, throw one in the comments. I'm also going to do some on Jordan Peterson. That's the other one that springs to mind. JP. I'd love to do one on JP, Jordan Peterson. He's a very fascinating man, and I'd love to unpack his body and expose more of who he is from my point of view. All right. Mad love. Bye.